Guys, today I'm very excited to welcome somebody I've really looked up to for a long time, the great George Gammon. He's been a successful entrepreneur, successful real estate investor, and one of my favorite people on YouTube to watch. George, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I can't wait to dive into the conversation.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, something that's really been going under the radar in I think just the mainstream media and the macro world is the bank term funding program. So it's expiring next month. And what do you think of what kind of impact is it going to have when it expires, and how impactful was it in really bailing these banks out and stopping the bleeding last year?
Well, I think we got to go back in time to March of 2023 when the bank term funding program was set up by the Federal Reserve. And the key difference between the BTFP and the discount window, as an example, which had already existed, was number one, stigma, but number two, with the BTFP, they could get 100 cents on the dollar.
Right.
So let's go back to Silicon Valley Bank. What happened? Well, they had assets, they had liabilities, but a lot of their assets that offset those commercial bank deposit liabilities were treasuries.
Right.
Right. And when I mean commercial bank deposit liabilities, I just mean people's checking accounts. Because what your viewers need to recognize is if you have $1,000 in your bank account, there's not $1,000 there. That's just simply a representation of what the bank owes you.
Right.
So if you take those $1,000 from, let's say, Wells Fargo, and I want to move it over to Bank of America, well, the bank transfers that commercial deposit liability to the other bank, but they also have to transfer an offsetting asset, or they have to settle in some other way. But we'll keep it super basic and say that they have to transfer an offsetting asset. So what happened to Silicon Valley Bank, or First Republic, Signature, et cetera, is they had these assets that fell in price because they were interest rate sensitive. They had treasuries, which are supposed to be extremely safe. They are safe and liquid. But unfortunately, what happens when the interest rates go up, the value of that treasury goes down. So the value of their assets were going down at a flight of these deposit liabilities. So they just weren't able to cover all of the settlement transactions with the other banks. So they go bust. So what the Fed does is they say, okay, if you want to go ahead and pledge those treasuries to us for collateral, we'll give you 100 cents on the dollar. And
Right.
that would have bailed them out. That bailed out many other banks because we saw the utilization go from zero straight up to 65 billion very
Right.
quickly. Now, if they would have gone to the discount window, these other banks, they might not have survived. Why? Because if they would have pledged those treasury securities, well, now all of a sudden they would have got whatever the market rate was.
Yeah.
They would have got, let's say, 50 cents on the dollar, and they still would have most likely been in the exact same position. So the fact they got 100 cents on the dollar was absolutely key. It's crucial to understand that difference. So since March of 2023, the BTFP, the utilization, has gone from 65 billion straight up to, I don't know where it is today. It was right around 140,
180.
160. No, it was much more than 80, wasn't it?
No, 180, I believe.
Oh, 180. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew it was right around 160 or so. The bottom line is it's still gone up and up and up. Now, a lot of people would argue that this is a result of an arbitrage that the Fed inadvertently, or maybe it wasn't so inadvertent, but seeing as how they're owned by the banks, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Say that it was just they didn't understand the unintended consequences. So they set up this BTFP. Well, the interest rate on the BTFP that they used starting in November of 2023 was lower than the interest rate they were paying on bank reserves.
Right.
So this is this arbitrage where the bank's like, well, this is a no-brainer. I'm just going to borrow from the Fed at, let's say, it wasn't 4.5, but I'll just keep the numbers simple to follow here. So I can borrow at the Fed at 4.5, and they'll pay me 5.25 on my reserves. I'm going to do this all day long and just pocket a free 75 basis points.
Right.
So the argument is the reason why the BTFP went up to where it is today is because of this arbitrage, but that doesn't completely make sense. The reason why is because that arbitrage didn't come into effect until November. So if we look at the utilization of the BTFP from March or April of 2023 to November, it still went straight up.
Right.
So when there's no arbitrage. So you have to assume that the first move up, the second move up, was a result of stress in the system.
Right.
It was a result of these banks needing to use that, or else they likely would have gone bust. Now, this third and final move up, after the arbitrage came into effect, how much of that is a result of what? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. But you can't sit there and say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it was all due to this arbitrage. So then the question becomes, all right, what happens when the BTFP is no longer there? Now, if you would have asked me this 2 months ago, I would have said there's almost a zero probability that they don't extend the BTFP.
Yep.
But sure enough, I was completely proven wrong about 3 weeks ago, or maybe 4 weeks ago, when Jerome Powell came out and made the announcement that they're actually going to let the program expire. And I'm like, okay. And what was interesting is right around this time, they started to really push the discount window.
Yes.
And they went so far as to say that they might even make it mandatory for banks to use the discount window at least once a year. So why would they do that? Because there is such a stigma around the discount window. And we have to remember that the banking system is just a network of banks. So if one bank would go to this discount window because they got in trouble, all the other banks would know about it.
Right.
And then those other banks would be far less inclined to give them liquidity or whatever it is they need moving forward. Either they're not using the discount window because they know that, hey, if this guy, if his balance sheet is bad enough to where he had to use them to begin with, no, I don't want to do business with it. Basically, you're in the monetary doghouse as a bank, and it just increases the probability that even after the discount window, you're going to hit the same place, and that's going out of business. And so they avoided this at all costs. So what they would do is they would use things like the Federal Home Loan Bank. Now, what this was is it was set up to facilitate mortgages. So these smaller banks, community banks, they could access the Federal Home Loan Bank if they needed some liquidity, and it was meant for people to go out there buy homes. So what you see is when the demand for homes really goes up, as an example, from 2000 to, let's say, 2006, you see that the utilization for the Federal Home Loan Bank goes up as well. But then when you get to a crisis like the GFC, it goes parabolic. Why? Is that because all these banks are giving out mortgages? No. No. Because they're using it as liquidity instead of going to the discount window, because there's no stigma. You see, if they use the Federal Home Loan Bank, they can sit back and say, oh, well, no, my balance sheet's pristine. What are you talking about? I don't have problems. No. I'm just going over here to the Federal Home Loan Bank because I want to issue some more mortgages. Yeah, that's it. And you say, oh, you're issuing more mortgages in 2009, huh? That's weird. Oh, just, look, a squirrel. That's kind of their game plan with this Federal Home Loan Bank. So my point here is now you can look at the utilization on the Federal Home Loan Bank. You can look at the utilization on the BTFP. And then you can look at the utilization on the at the discount window, and you can see how close we are to potentially another like GFC type of event. So I don't know what the utilization is now, but my point there is what you would likely see is first and foremost utilization on Federal Home Loan Bank to go up very quickly, and then most likely BFT go up, assuming we still have it. Now, if we don't have it, then they're just going to go directly to the discount window, because that's quite literally the lender of last resort.
Right. Well, so that leads to a question that I had from like the instant they started raising rates so fast. So we know that the treasuries, the U.S. treasuries are like the foundation of the financial world, right? They're used as collateral for the vast majority of things. So how was it that rates were able to go up from 0 to 5% in like a year and a half, and it didn't cause like a massive margin call domino effect with all the treasury rehypothecation there is and everything? Like I was really surprised that that didn't have some sort of cascading effect, and that the SVB was the biggest extent that we saw that happen in.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a great question. But what you have to realize is in the monetary system, especially when you get outside the United States and the euro dollar network, they're mostly using T-bills. Right. So what they can do, if you got a 1 month T-bill, you can just let it mature. And even if the
Oh.
price, even if the interest rates go way up, let's say the interest rates went from 1% to 10%, it's not going to impact you unless you sell. If you
Okay.
just hold it to maturity, then you're good to go. And in fact, if you look at or if you compartmentalize Silicon Valley Bank's balance sheet, what you see is they had all of these treasuries in an account, for lack of a better word, called hold to maturity. So when it's hold to maturity, then basically what you're telling the regulators is, well, you can't really count this, or we can't use mark-to-market accounting on this because we're not going to sell them. So the fact that the price is going down on this 10-year treasury that I hold, or the price is going up, you really can't factor that into whether or not we are in a position of strength as far as our balance sheet, because we bought this for $1 million. So, but we're just going to hold it to maturity and just get the $1 million back plus interest.
Gotcha.
We don't plan to sell. Obviously, the problem with that, what we found, is that if they're put into a position where they have to sell, now all of a sudden they can't hold it to maturity, and that creates the big problem and the cascading effect we saw.
Right. Okay. So the majority of this rehypothecation we hear about, that's in T-bills, not in treasuries. Okay.
Yeah, and that's another. I don't want to get too technical, but that's another reason why there's a bit of a premium on the treasuries that they call on the run treasuries, as opposed to off the run treasuries. But that's not really relevant for this type of conversation. It is just to show that the majority of those treasuries that are used as collateral in the monetary system are going to be T-bills, because the reason they're used to begin with is for safety and liquidity. And if there's interest rate risk, they're obviously not as safe.
Right. Gotcha. So with this commercial real estate issue that we're hearing about, it's small banks especially that have the most exposure to them. I saw some numbers from, I think it was JP Morgan and Citibank, saying that 70% of the commercial real estate exposure was held on the balance sheet of small banks. So how significant of a threat do you think that is to small banks in like the next year or two? Because I don't think it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when there's an issue with commercial real estate. Do you think that'll have a negative or bad impact on commercial banks or the small banks?
Yeah, I do. And the argument would be, well, by now they should have hedged out that risk. But if that was the case, then we wouldn't have New York Community Bank.
Right.
If you followed that story, they haven't gone bust yet, but I think their share price went down by like 50% in one day. That was last week or the week prior, as a result of just having all these, what effectively are toxic assets on their balance sheet. And they had these on their balance sheet for quite some time. They actually absorbed a lot of the balance sheet from Signature.
Wow.
That turned out to be not too smart of a move. but my point is, they should have been able to, if they could have hedged it out, they probably would have over the last 6 months, and it's still giving them a big problem. So to your point, I think moving forward with this commercial real estate crisis and how this is going to impact those regional banks or those smaller banks, we're only in inning 4 or 5.
Okay.
If that.
Wow.
We've got a long way to go on this. And so, you can say, well, the Fed is going to be able to be there to save the day. Well, okay, where were they 3 days prior to Silicon Valley Bank going bust?
Right.
You see, so the Fed always comes out and says that they have all the tools to handle everything. Oh, don't worry about it. We got a tool for that. Oh, don't worry about it. We got this extensive toolkit. They always say they've got the tools to handle every situation. But yet every single time we have one of these crises, they have to come up with a different tool.
Yeah.
So no, you didn't have all the tools, did you? I mean, it's pretty much proof when you just go back and look at how they respond and how they're always behind the curve. But I think a bigger question there is not just what it does to the regional banks, but how that impacts all of the banks. And see, this is what very few people understand. And even if they do, they don't really think it through, in my opinion. Because you can sit there and have all this toxic debt on the balance sheet of these regionals, but we have to remember that the banking system is a network.
Right.
Network. And even if JP Morgan doesn't have all of this commercial real estate on its balance sheet, it's still part of that network of other banks. So why is it so interconnected? Because if you look at like a diagram of the Eurodollar system as an example, you see that one bank's liabilities are another bank's assets.
Right.
So we got bank A, B, and C, right? So you got bank B's liabilities are bank A's assets. Bank C's liabilities are bank B's assets. Right? And bank A's liabilities are C's assets. So if you have one of those banks go bust within that network, it pretty much brings down the whole thing. Even if the other balance sheets are rock solid, with the exception of that counterparty risk that they had to the bank that went bust. It's like a daisy chain.
Yeah, right.
So it is true that Wells Fargo, as an example, is in a much better position than they were maybe in 2007 or 2008. But that still doesn't mean that we're completely out of the woods, because if the risk in the overall system goes up, then that means liquidity dries up. You see, what most people need to realize, especially when you get outside of the United States, the banks don't settle with green pieces of paper, meaning dollars, like cash dollars, hard currency. You don't have a Brinks truck that's driving dollars from the bank of the Cayman Islands to the bank in Singapore.
It's Swift, right?
It doesn't work that way. No, they're not even really trading bank reserves. Really, the only thing that they're doing is just giving IOUs. So let's just, as a hypothetical, say that both you and I have a bank, and we've been doing business together for 20 years. Right. So we know each other. We know that we're going to manage our balance sheets in a way that's prudent. We don't have to worry about it. So but neither of us are connected to the Fed's balance sheet. We're one of these offshore banks, shadow banks, if you will, in the Eurodollar system that create the majority of the dollars in the world. It isn't necessarily the banks in the United States. So what happens is, let's say that I have this customer and I lend them $1 million. So these dollars didn't exist before. I just simply create the loan, and then I create the increase, or I increase the balance, the account balance of the entity that I just lent the $1 million to. Right? Because again, that's just a commercial bank liability. So I just take their checking account balance from 0 up to $1 million. I just created money out of thin air.
And that's money.
I didn't have any money to begin with. I had zero. I had none. So where most people get confused is they think that banks actually lend money that already exists. That is not what happens.
No.
Banks create money through the process of lending. Because let's just look at the balance sheet. So my balance sheet has assets, it has liabilities. So even if I have zero assets, when I lend money, I create that $1 million liability, because that's now my customer's checking account balance. But then the offsetting asset is the loan that I just created. Right? So that's a loan. So then let's just assume that customer says, you know what, George, I don't want to deal with your bank. I want to deal with the other bank. Or I've got to pay this person $1 million to buy their house or something. So then I call you and say, you know what, I've got to transfer over this $1 million deposit liability that I just created by lending this money into existence. And you say, yeah, no problem. Just send it over. And I say, okay, well, how do we want to settle? And you say, well, I mean, I'd like to settle with treasuries. Well, don't have that. Okay, well, I don't know. How about we settle through a correspondent banking relationship with bank reserves on the Fed's balance sheet? No, don't have any of those. Well, what do you have? Well, I just have this loan that I just created. I have no other assets. And you say, well, I don't really want to take that, but I know you. We've been doing business for the last 20 years. So what I'll do is I'll just extend you credit. You can just pay me later. Just owe me the $1 million in a year or something like that, or whenever you get it. No big deal. So what happens? So you say, George, well, this other bank just received a liability. What is their offsetting asset? It's just simply the loan that they just created for me, for my bank, because all I did is give them an IOU, and that IOU becomes the offsetting asset to that liability that I just transferred over. You see, so what ends up, my point here
Yeah.
is what ends up happening with all of these dollars. Now, how many dollars are out there that were created like this with no cash, no reserves? We're talking trillions.
Yeah.
If I had to guess, I'd say it's somewhere north of 50 trillion outside of the United States. So the only settlement asset was simply an IOU from another bank. So you can see, but what enabled that transaction to happen? It was one thing: confidence. That's it. Because there were no assets, there were no treasuries, there were no bank reserves, there were no green pieces of paper. It's simply that you trust me.
Right.
You have confidence that I'll pay you back, or you have confidence that in the future you'll send me $1 million deposit liability, and then I'll extend you the credit, and then you can just give me your IOUs.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is if the confidence goes down or the perceived risk goes up, now all of a sudden I say, hey, I've got to transfer you that $1 million liability. You say, no, not going to happen.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. Well, if I know that I can't transfer it, then I'm not going to create the loan to begin with.
Right.
You say, okay, George, well, that's better off because we have less debt in the system. You got to think that one through because we're in a debt-based monetary system.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is if there's $500,000 of debt that's created alone, that's principal plus interest. So
Right.
if you were to pay that back, let's say in a year, you had a balloon payment, you'd have to pay back the $500,000, but you'd have to pay back interest. Let's say that's $100,000. So you actually owe $600,000, but there's only been $500,000 that was created
Right.
to begin with, right? So how does that work? There's literally not enough currency units to pay off all of the debt plus interest. So we have two options there. Either we have to create more and more and more and more debt to pay off the old debt, or what we have to do is we have to have the economy really running on all 8 cylinders, which creates velocity of money. You see, if we have that velocity of money, then we can pay off, let's say, $20 worth of debt with only $10.
Right.
It just has to change hands pretty quickly. And I know that gets confusing for people, but I'd have to model it out on a whiteboard. But you can see how that would actually work out. But the problem here is that when risk goes up, velocity is most likely going down. And therefore, the only other option is create more currency units through lending them into existence. But nobody's going to do that if the risk is higher because they have to get paid back. They don't want to go bust. So what ends up happening is you create this deflationary bust within the banking system, even if there's a lot of banks within that network that have strong balance sheets.
Right. So that actually creates a question I was really curious about from one of your videos the other day when you were breaking down the Eurodollar system and how there's actually a shortage of collateral. Does that mean that when Congress deficit spends, that's actually alleviating that problem of the treasury shortage? And that, like, I doubt that they're smart enough to where they would be doing like deficit spending to alleviate that treasury shortage, but would reducing the amount of deficit spending actually make that problem worse?
So this is a great question.
Thanks.
This is a fantastic question. And this is something that I try to get people to think about because a lot of people understand Triffin's paradox or Triffin's dilemma.
Yeah.
But they understand it through the lens of the dollar, meaning that back in 44, Keynes and Triffin came out and said, yeah, be careful of that Bretton Woods deal. Because what this means is the United States is going to have to create enough dollars for the global economy. And although that may benefit the global economy, that'll probably come at the detriment of the U.S. economy. See? So now what's fascinating is we have a similar setup with treasuries, to your point, where in order to provide the monetary system enough collateral, the United States government needs to run bigger and bigger and bigger deficits. But if they do that, although that might be better for the global economy, that's going to be a lot worse for the U.S. economy.
Right.
See, so you're in this very weird kind of catch-22. Now you could say, well, George, screw the other countries. We got to focus on United States. Trump, we got to make America great again. We got to focus on our problems here. So if they need treasuries, tell them to pound sand. Okay, well, think that one through. Because if the global economy suffers, you don't think the United States economy is going to suffer as well. In fact, I just did a whiteboard video today where I went over how interconnected the economies are. And I don't know if you know this, but Japan just announced that they went into a recession. Germany, likely in a recession. UK in the recession. Eurozone headed straight for recession. China hasn't admitted they're in a recession, but they're facing the worst deflation that they've had in decades.
Yep.
Right. So what I did, but everyone says, well, my gosh, this is never going to impact the United States because our stock market is at all-time highs and we have low unemployment. Well, what I did is I looked at some charts going back to the 1970s to see how many times the UK and Germany or the Eurozone had been in recession without the United States being in a recession. And that would be 0 times. That would be 0 times. Now, you had the Eurozone in recession back in 2012, but the UK was not in recession at that time. So again, the setup that we have right now, we have never seen that before without the United States also going into recession. And the pushback you get there, well, this time it's different because the stock market, unemployment, like we just said. But what people need to realize is if you look at the Japanese stock market, where do you think it is right now?
Yeah.
All-time highs.
Japanese
unemployment rate, 2.5%. Way less than ours. Yet the government announced that they are actually in a recession. Germany, stock market, all-time highs. Unemployment, relatively low. They just came out and announced they're in a recession. UK, stock market, all-time highs. Unemployment, very, very low.
Wow.
They just announced that they're in a recession. So I don't know that's a fantastic argument as to why the United States can never, ever, ever go into a recession, or the probability is very low, especially when you look at that data combined with everything else, such as the yield curve inversion.
Right, and the unemployment data is measured in such a flawed way. I don't know if you saw the Zero Hedge article breaking it down with all the charts about the revisions and the native-born workers. Yeah, you saw that one? Yeah, so I mean, the unemployment rate is probably nowhere near 3.7%, especially with all the part-time jobs they measure instead of full-time jobs. So that's a distorted measure. And then with the stock market, it was steadily going down until the Fed announced the rate cuts in October. So I was wondering, I know you did the video about the lag effect a while ago in terms of, on average, I think it takes 11 months from the time they stop cutting rates until the recession actually happens. But
about 18, yeah.
About 18. So do you think that principle still applies today, or is that distorted by injecting $6 trillion into the economy over the last 4 years?
Well, it's a great question. I do think that government deficit spending has a big impact. That's for sure. I don't know that the Fed's balance sheet has an impact. And in fact, it might even, if it does have an impact, it might be the reverse. So let's start there. If we do go into recession, what do you think the Fed's going to do? I mean, all your viewers know this.
Lower rates.
There you go. You got it.
Yeah.
You got it. They're going to do exactly what they've done over the past decade. They're just going to do more and more quantitative easing. Well, what is quantitative easing? It's simply when they're buying things like treasuries and they're putting them on their balance sheet, and they're just replacing those treasuries with bank reserves. Let's just say the transaction is just between the Fed and another bank. Well, let's go back to your earlier question about the collateral that the global monetary system needs to the point where it's mandatory. You've got to look at those treasuries as oil in an engine. If you take that oil out of the engine, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
It's going to seize up. It's going to freeze. So what the Fed is doing through quantitative easing is they are taking all of these treasuries that the monetary system needs, and they're parking them on their balance sheet so the monetary system can no longer use them.
Oh, wow.
You see?
Yeah.
Now, you may say, George, they have access to it, right? But they can't rehypothecate it. And as bad as that is, it's still something that's mandatory for the way the current monetary system is actually set up. You say, well, George, this is nonsense because they're replacing it with a bank reserve, and that's even more liquid. Wrong. That is absolutely wrong. So why is a treasury more valuable or more useful than a bank reserve? Because all of these banks out in the Eurodollar system that we were just talking about, they don't have access to the Fed's balance sheet. So if you look at this as the monetary plumbing, there's pipes that go from one bank to the next bank, to the hedge fund, to the pension fund, to all of the players that are not just in the banking system, but are in the financial economy, right?
Right.
And the problem with a bank reserve is it can only move through certain pipes
Oh, okay.
because those pipes go to the Fed's balance sheet.
Right.
And if you're a hedge fund or a pension fund in Japan, you don't have a pipe that goes to the Fed's balance sheet.
Gotcha.
Therefore, to get access to those reserves, you have to go through all these correspondent banking relationships, and it's very cumbersome and very costly, by the way. But if you have a treasury, you see that treasury can go through any pipe it wants to.
Okay.
And it's effectively cash, right? Because what is a treasury, especially if you have a 1 month T-bill? It's just basically the equivalent of cash or bank reserves. It's dollars that you're just being paid a little interest rate. It's dollars that mature in a month.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's what people need to really understand. And I would really encourage your viewers to check out the work of a gentleman named Manmohan. I always mess up his name. It's Manmohan. So Manmohan Singh. And he is one of the foremost experts on how this works, and he is with the IMF. And he's done a couple YouTube videos where he's done presentations for like the Brookings Institute and whatnot. But check those out. And after that, I think your viewers will really understand how crucial or mandatory those treasuries are to the monetary system. So go back to a recession. The Fed is doing all of this QE, taking those out of play. So on net balance, is that going to make things better or worse? Maybe in the short run, it might make things a little bit better because it might bail out the domestic system. But over the long run, that's making the system itself far more fragile.
Wow, that's a crazy perspective. I never would have thought that quantitative tightening is potentially greasing and giving oil to the monetary system, and quantitative easing is doing the reverse. That's what I love about macro. You're always stumbling across counterintuitive perspectives. But yeah, George, I could literally talk to you for 3 hours. This has been amazing so far. But thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. Absolute legend right there. Cannot recommend his content enough. If you want to check out George Gammon's content, go to George Gammon on YouTube or The Rebel Capitalist on YouTube to get the best macroeconomic central bank education you'll find anywhere. If you want to know how these people are operating, go to George Gammon, Rebel Capitalist. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video and check out George Gammon himself. God bless.